Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm so sorry for the delay in uploading this video. I got caught up in my uni exams, but I do hope you enjoyed the last video, which was chapters 15 to 20. If you haven't already seen it, go listen to it before you listen to this one. I'll leave the link in the description below. This will be the next 5 chapters. Before we get started, I would greatly appreciate and love if you could like and subscribe to my channel. Also, please leave a comment down below. I would love to hear from you all. Without further ado, let's get started. 21. Gideon. Rune Winters has no casting scars, Gideon told Harrow as they climbed the marble steps together. Harrow arched a thin brow. You certainly move fast. It's not like that, he said quickly. I needed her measurements for a dress I'm making her. Harrow's brow arched higher. You, my brawny friend, are cleverer than I gave you credit for. They passed under the columned entrance and into Bloodguard headquarters. When it was still the Royal Library, this building preserved witch propaganda, histories full of lies, and entire floors of spellbooks. Gideon remembered the marble busts of notable witches that once lined the wings, as well as the gilt-framed paintings depicting the golden age of the witches. All of it was gone, destroyed in the early days of the New Republic. If she doesn't have scars, I can't accuse her. How closely did you look? Gideon thought back to the dark, boarded-up shop, to Rune's nearly naked form standing in the glow of his lamp. The lighting was poor, but trust me, I looked. His memory was like a faucet. Once he opened the valve even a little, he couldn't stop everything from rushing out. The memory of her soft white curves, the delicate lace of her bra, the scent of her skin. Gideon had gotten very close to a nearly naked Rune, and he had looked. There was nothing to find. She's flawless. She was completely nude? Asked Harrow. What? No, you don't do measurements in the nude. Well, there's your problem. The Crimson Moth won't have casting scars where someone like you could find them. How do you think she escaped detection the past 2 years? You'll need to get her good and naked. The words were a lightning strike, but Harrow was right. Rune hadn't been entirely unclothed, and he'd inspected her quickly in dim lighting. Gideon ran a hand over his face. How was he supposed to get Rune Winters naked? Maybe I won't have to. Harrow rolled her eyes. You have some other plan? They entered the atrium, which was encircled by a massive staircase spiraling to the top floor. Overhead, the glass dome ceiling revealed a sky full of clouds. Holding up the dome were statues of 7 ancients, chiseled out of marble. Liberty with her gun held high, Mercy with her arc of doves flying toward the glass, Wisdom with an owl on her shoulder and an open book in her hands. Do you remember it? Asked Harrow, halting halfway to the stairs, standing now in the center of the atrium. Gideon turned to find her staring at a spot in the middle of the floor where the tiles didn't match. There used to be a tree that grew right here, she said, going quiet. It reached all the way to the 4th floor. Gideon nodded. Rioters had destroyed it too after the revolution, hacking it apart, uprooting the stump, and burning it all. Every spring, it blossomed for a month straight. My mistress, Juniper, loved to come when the blossoms dropped. They would carpet the floor in a sea of white. Harrow swallowed, lost in the memory. She said that Amity herself planted it here, and centuries later, people built the library around it. Gideon had never heard Harrow speak about the witch who'd indented her. Was she purged? He asked. This snapped Harrow out of the memory. Her footsteps started again, hastening toward the stairs. No, A heavy silence hung between them. It meant this Juniper was still out there somewhere. He wondered if her memory haunted Harrow the way Cressida's memory haunted him. Is she the one who... Gideon pointed to his ear. Harrow reached to touch the place where her ear used to be, before a witch had cut it off. No, but neither did she stop it. What other kinds of cruelty had Harrow suffered at the hands of witches? And how could she not know or care if her former mistress was dead or alive? But Harrow clearly didn't want to discuss it further because she changed the subject. You were talking about your plan to entrap Rune Winters. Together they started for the stairs. The one that doesn't involve getting her naked? How is that going to work? Their footsteps echoed in unison as they climbed to the second floor, where Gideon's office lay. I gave Rune bad information this morning. Harrow glanced over at him. Oh? I told her the location of a holding cell for witches near Seldom Harbour. And that's bad? There's no holding cell near Seldom Harbour, just a trap waiting for the Crimson Moth. Harrow's golden eyes widened. As this sank in, she smiled, impressed. And you think Rune will show up there? I don't know. If she does, I'll have my fugitive. But even if someone else shows up instead, I'll know Rune is in league with the Moth, since she's the only person I gave the location to. And if no one shows up? Get inside. Then I abandon this false trail, break things off with Rune, and hope my little brother finds his balls. 22. Rune. The old mine near Seldom Harbour stood on a small cliff top 100 meters above sea level, sagging beneath the weight of a century. Rune came prepared with an invisibility spell already drawn on her forearm in blood. She called it Ghostwalker, and it was her most used spell on nights like this, one she'd created herself using a combination of two symbols she'd found in one of Nan's books. The symbols for emptiness and evasion. It didn't make her disappear so much as nudge a person's attention away from her. She dismounted Lady a quarter-mile up the dirt road. Leaving the horse to graze in a small copse of trees, Rune headed toward the mine, which was silhouetted by the light of a silver moon. The wind and sea salt stung Rune's eyes, the only part of her face left uncovered. Dressed entirely in black, she'd hidden her hair beneath a hood and covered her mouth and nose with a snug cowl. A fitted black shirt and leggings concealed the rest of her, along with calf-high leather boots. The lantern hanging in the entryway swung in the gusty wind, scattering its light across the blood-guard standing sentry. As Rune drew nearer to the stone building, she saw that the guard on duty was none other than Lila Creed. With her spell cloaking her, Rune pulled out a slender silver whistle no wider than a fountain pen from the hidden pocket in her clothes. The same pocket contained her last full vial of blood. Drawing closer to Lila, she put the cold metal to her lips and blew 3 short, hard notes. The notes were too high-pitched for Lila's ears, but Lady heard them immediately. Lady had once been Nan's favorite show horse. Nan trained her to respond to different whistled commands, and her obedience had won them dozens of ribbons over the years. In the darkness, sounding closer than she was, Lady whinnied. Hearing it, Lila grabbed the pistol at her hip, eyes narrowing. Her gaze bounced off the space where Rune stood and turned toward the sound. That's right, thought Rune. Go check. Better to be safe. Glancing back to the mine's entryway, a sun-bleached door with speckled lichen, Lila strode hesitantly into the dark. Rune opened the door and stepped inside. The entrance to the mine was a small room with wood-paneled walls and 2 small windows, one of which was broken. The old floorboards shifted beneath her footsteps, and in the center of the floor was a hole big enough for 2 burly men to drop into. A ladder protruded out of it. When she peered in, all she could see was the darkness below. Rune frowned, her skin prickling. The Blood Guard had been getting more and more creative with their holding locations, which made it more difficult for Rune to guess where they were keeping captured witches. Normally, though, there were more guards than this. Crouching, she tried to see down into the first level of the mine and caught a shimmer of light in the distance. Someone's there. Still, Rune hesitated, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. But if Seraphine was down there and Rune walked away right now, they would transfer her to the palace tonight, and Rune might never get the chance to save her. And if they already transferred her, I'll just go down and look around. Rune touched the small knife she'd strapped onto her thigh, drawing courage from its freshly honed steel. With her feet on the rungs, still cloaked by her ghost walker spell, she lowered herself into the darkness. It got colder and damper the lower she went, and the ladder rungs were slick beneath her hands. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she let go and turned into the pitch, her gaze seeking the warm glow in the distance. There was a rush of air, movement in the dark. The hair on her nape rose. Trap, said her brain, seconds before her body caught up. Rune spun to grab the ladder and haul herself up, when a hand seized her wrist and clamped down with vise-like strength. Gotcha. Rune swung with her fist, but the darkness made her assailant as invisible as she was, and she'd missed his face. Before she could try again, he seized her other wrist and forced her to her knees. Rune quailed at the strength in him as he easily wrestled her to the ground, pressing her cheek into the cold rock and pinning her there with his knees on either side of her hips, immobilizing her. The smell of fresh-cut cedar and gunpowder overwhelmed her. You have no idea how long I've waited for this day. The voice was unmistakable. Gideon. White-hot anger burned in her breast. He'd set her up, baited the trap, and waited for her to step into it. I'm such a fool. And now he had her pinned, defenseless, exactly where he wanted her. But how did he see her? He doesn't, she realized. This level was so dark, he couldn't see anything. Neither of them could. He must have heard Rune coming down the ladder. If she survived this, she would need to tweak her spell to muffle sound. Your friend isn't here. I gathered that, yes, thought Rune, crushed beneath his weight. He planted both palms on her shoulder blades, immobilizing her. Her hands were still free, but because of the way he pinned her, she couldn't use them to reach for her knife. Someone's got your tongue, little moth? No way was Rune talking. If it was too dark for him to see her, she might still have a chance of keeping her identity intact. She'd have to wait for him to let her up before she tried anything. He couldn't keep her pinned forever. And if he has a lamp? Ghostwalker kept Rune shielded so long as someone didn't know she was there, by nudging their attention away from her. The spell could try its hardest to force Gideon's gaze away, but he was sitting on top of Rune. He knew exactly where she was. Her spell could no longer deceive him, and if Gideon had a lamp, the moment he lit it, all he would have to do was yank her cowl down and pull back her. There was a soft hiss of a flare, then a red glow like an ember behind her. No! Panic zipped through her. As the flare sizzled and the glow brightened, he reached for her hood. The moment he pulled it back and set free her hair, a red gold shade he would instantly recognize. It would mean the end for Rune. In order to hold the flare and pull back her hood though, Gideon had to remove his hands from her. With the weight of him gone, Rune was free to reach for the knife strapped to her thigh. So she did. Her fingers wrapped around the hilt. He tugged at her hood, sliding it back from her forehead. Rune drew the knife from its sheath and stabbed hard, not caring where the blade went in, so long as it went in deep. Gideon howled and rolled off her. Free, Rune stumbled to her feet and ran. She'd never been inside a mine. She knew nothing about them. One thing Rune was pretty sure of, though, there was only one way in and out, and she was running in the opposite direction of it. Rune quickly found the source of the light she'd seen from above, a lamp hanging midway down a narrow tunnel. The ceiling was so low, Rune had to duck to keep from hitting her head on it. She thought of Verity and Alex. She should have taken their advice, avoided the Bloodguard captain at all costs. He hasn't won yet. She heard Gideon stumbling behind her, cursing as he closed in. So long as he didn't catch her, she could still make it out of this. But if he caught her, she'd go straight to the purge. That thought made her run faster. At the end of the illuminated tunnel was another ladder, this one leading to the level below. She didn't want to go further down, wading deeper into his trap, but as she glanced over her shoulder and sighted a limping Gideon in the distance, neither could she go back. So she went down. It was even colder on the level below, and the floor was slick with water. Rune slipped multiple times and had to grope the wall to keep from falling. Without the lamp on the first level, she couldn't see a thing. Several times she found the way blocked by cave-ins and had to double back. The water deepened too, the further she went. When Gideon's boots thudded on the ladder behind her, adrenaline zipped through Rune. Stumbling through the water, she lurched down another tunnel, feeling along the walls, trying to put as much space as possible between herself and the witch hunter. She stepped into a pool of water and nearly fell straight in. At the last second, she scrambled, throwing her weight back and slamming into the rock wall behind her. This mine isn't just caving in on itself, she thought, breathing hard as the damp seeped through her clothes. It's being swallowed by the sea. Water flooded this whole level. In the dark, Rune tried to follow the walls around the flood hole and nearly fell in again. There was no lip or ledge, just a watery, seemingly bottomless pit. Behind her lay the tunnel she'd come down, a dead end. Light flashed and Rune turned to see Gideon in the tunnel, headed straight for her. He had that flare in his hand, and the closer he came, the more the small cavern she stood in brightened. Rune glanced around her, trying to think. Her spell was still intact, and since Gideon didn't know for sure that she was in here, the spell marks on her wrist would keep working their magic, pushing his attention away from her. Or so she hoped. But even if it did hold, all Gideon had to do was continue walking and he'd bump right into Rune. There was nowhere for her to go. It was too cramped to dart around him. Unless... She eyed the dark pool. The top of a ladder poked up a few inches above the surface, suggesting this hole had once been the entrance to the mine's third level. The water was murky, the color of mud. Rune couldn't see 3 feet down, never mind the bottom, even with Gideon's light growing stronger. Pulling her hood down toward her eyes, Rune stared at the water. It would be cold, freezing cold. Could she hold her breath long enough to stay hidden? She didn't know. But if she didn't want Gideon to catch her, she only had one option, and it was this one. Reaching down, she grabbed the slippery sides of the ladder and slowly lowered herself in, gasping at the icy temperature. She descended slowly, not wanting to make too many ripples. As she did, her eyes locked with Gideon's, or they would have if he could see her. He glanced right past Rune, scanning the cavern's shadows. Relieved, Rune let out a breath. Ghostwalker was still doing its job, convincing him she wasn't here. He'll be able to see me as soon as I come up for air, she realized, glancing at the bloody marks on her wrist, knowing the water would wash them away in moments. But what choice did she have? Before Gideon closed the gap, Rune sucked in a lungful of air and went under, using the ladder to pull herself as far down as she dared, out of his reach and into the murky water. She felt the spell weaken the further down she went, then fade entirely. Rune opened her eyes and looked up, half expecting to be confronted by Gideon's dark and deadly gaze. Instead, she saw nothing but murk, and the dim glow of his flare in the cavern above. Rune held herself still. The cold water slowed her pulse. Soon her lungs pinched, wanting air, but the glow overhead didn't recede. He was still in this cavern with her. Her lungs burned. Rune squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold on a little longer, knowing she had only seconds until her time ran out. When it felt like her chest would burst, she opened her eyes and looked up to find only blackness. Darkness everywhere. Gideon had taken his flare and left. She let go of the ladder and surged upward, gasping for breath when she hit the surface. The moment she did, two firm hands grabbed her and dragged her out. 23. Rune. Rune bucked against Gideon, whose arms were locked tight around her, keeping her back pinned to his chest. "If I didn't want you dead," he said, his voice low in her ear, "I'd be tempted to admire your cunning." Rune gritted her teeth. "I'm flattered." His flare had died. With no light, she couldn't see a thing, but she could feel quite a lot. He was all hard, menacing muscle. There wasn't an inch of softness in him. With him pressed against her, Rune felt their size difference. One of his hands wrapped easily around her bicep. His strength, combined with his size, would beat her every time in a physical struggle, so Rune stopped struggling. She fell still in his arms, catching her breath and trying to regroup. He was warm as a furnace, and Rune's body temperature was dropping rapidly. The chill of the water had seeped into her skin, and her wet clothes locked in the cold. But the heat of him staved off the worst of it. "I'm happy to drag you out of here like this." Even his breath was hot against her cheek. "But if you prefer to walk yourself out, I'll put on the restraints." No way was she letting him put those on her. The restraints the blood guard used on witches trapped their entire hands in iron, preventing them from casting spells. But neither was she letting him drag her out of here. If Rune knew where her knife had gone, if she could dig the heel of her boot into the wound, that would hurt enough that he might let her go. But without a light, it would be a mere guess, and if she'd missed the first time, she doubted he'd give her the opportunity for another. No preference then? Rune kept her mouth clamped shut, still thinking. She knew the pool of water was directly behind them, and the tunnel directly ahead. "Suit yourself." The moment she felt his grip loosen slightly, Rune planted her feet, bent her knees, and pushed back with all her might. She heard a huff of surprise, felt his weight shift as he lost balance. He staggered back. Rune had hoped he'd throw his arms wide in his struggle to regain his balance. Instead, he dragged her down with him. They fell into the water together. But Rune was ready for the icy shock. The moment the water closed over her head and Gideon let go, Rune pushed away from him. Her hands patted the walls of the pool until she found the ladder. Grabbing the rungs, she heaved herself out. Gideon cursed from behind her. She heard the water splash as he swam for the sides of the pool. In seconds, he'd be on her again. Using the walls to guide her, she ran through the dark tunnel, taking it to the first floor. Far behind her, she heard Gideon's loud swearing. Back on the first level, she dashed for the mine's entrance, following the lamplight. Swinging herself onto the last ladder, she scaled the rungs, climbing upward. She paused at the top, listening for Lila, and heard the girl's footsteps pacing the ground outside, beyond the door in the room above. Pulling herself into the small room, Rune approached the broken window and peered out. Beneath the swinging lantern out front, Lila stood in uniform, her pistol cocked on one shoulder as she stared into the darkness beyond. Rune adjusted her cowl and hood, hiding her face and hair once more as Gideon's voice roared from below. "Lila!" He sounded much too close. Lila spun, her footsteps approaching the door. "She's in here!" Gideon was already climbing the ladder. With Lila just outside, Rune was trapped between them. Rune pressed herself against the wall behind the door, listening to his boots thud against every rung, getting closer. She squeezed the vial in her hand. She had seconds. If she could quickly redraw the spell marks for Ghostwalker. The door swung in and Lila stepped inside. Rune froze. Before Lila could realize someone was in the room with her, pressed against the wall, Rune realized this was her one and only chance. She lunged outside. Lila spun to face her. Rune slammed the door shut and wedged herself against it, pushing all of her weight into the wood. Lila pushed from the other side. The door shuttered. Gideon would arrive any moment. Rune needed some way to seal it shut long enough to get away. The last time she tried picklock, she'd fainted from the effort, and its sister spell, Deadbolt, would be just as difficult to cast. "If you want to cast more complex spells," Verity's voice rang through her mind, "you need fresh blood." Rune drew the knife at her thigh. Its sheath had kept it semi-dry, and while some water had leaked in, the blade was still coated in Gideon's blood. The blood was diluted, but fresh. She knew it was dangerous. She hadn't asked his permission to use it, nor would she get permission if she had. But she hadn't stabbed him intending to use his blood. So maybe it would be okay. But what if it isn't? Lila fired her pistol. Rune winced as the shots cracked through the air and the bullets lodged in the rickety door. A few more shots and those bullets would break through. If Rune didn't cast the spell now, she was done for. Hoping she wasn't about to corrupt herself, Rune swiped her fingers through Gideon's blood, lifted them to the door, and drew the mark for Deadbolt. Salt prickled her tongue. The roaring sea swelled inside her. But this time, Rune wasn't standing in the waves, fighting to stay upright while the magic pummeled her back. This time, the waves were beneath her, and she was sailing swiftly through them on a craft of her own making. Is this what it's supposed to feel like? Rune immediately understood why witches used fresh blood. It was so easy. Beneath the roar of magic, something clicked into place. This time, it was Gideon who threw himself against the door. She heard him grunt, felt the force of his weight, but the door barely trembled. Deadbolt kept it locked, trapping both Bloodguard soldiers inside. Rune stumbled back, smiling in triumph. More shots rang out. Bullets splintered the wood. Her smile died on her lips. Rune turned and bolted. She slid the whistle from her pocket as she ran. Pressing it to her lips, she blew one hard, fierce note. Lady barreled out of the copse and up the dirt road, heading straight for her. Another shot rang out, and this one whizzed past Rune's head, rustling her hair. She glanced over her shoulder to find Lila aiming the barrel of her pistol through the broken window. Lady arrived, slowing a little, and Rune launched herself at the horse's back, struggling to mount as she trotted beneath her. Finally in the saddle, Rune's boots in the stirrups, she dug in her heels, letting Lady know this was one of those urgent situations she frequently got them into that Lady needed to now get them out of. But it was a few seconds before the massive horse could pick up enough speed to carry them out of range. A third shot rang out. This time, Rune felt the sharp sting of a bullet as it sliced her forearm. Warm, sticky blood seeped out. She couldn't afford to stop and check how bad it was. Right now, she needed to steer Lady away from Lila and her stinging bullets. After that, Rune stared at the lights of Seldom Harbour on the horizon, trying to think. 2 Bloodguard soldiers had seen the Crimson Moth at the old mine tonight. Rune Winters, therefore, needed to be seen somewhere else, preferably far away. She needed to get to the Creed's Mask Ball, and fast. 24. Gideon. Gideon was hauling himself up the last 3 rungs of the ladder when he heard Lila's pistol go off. He glanced up to find his hunting partner desperately pulling on the door, her black ponytail swishing with every yank. "Damn it!" Lila snarled. "She locked us in!" Gideon pulled himself into the room. His wounded leg protested every step as Lila moved aside to let him try. "Gideon, you're bleeding." The Moth's knife had missed the major arteries and tendons, but his thigh still hurt like hell. What annoyed him most, though, was not getting a look at her face before she plunged the blade in. "It looks worse than it is," he said, taking the tarnished metal latch in both hands and yanking on it. The door didn't budge. "I had her," he thought, throwing himself at the door. "She was in my hands." But why hadn't she gone for his neck with that knife? The Moth was a cold-hearted killer. Gideon had seen the corpses she'd abandoned in the city streets ruthlessly bled dry. So why aim for his leg? Lila moved to the window. The pane was smashed. Lifting her gun, Lila aimed through the broken glass and fired 3 times. "I think that last shot might have hit her," she said, peering out. The idea of Lila hitting her mark made Gideon stiffen. "If it was Rune..." Gideon scowled. Who cared if it was Rune? Rune or not, the Crimson Moth wouldn't think twice if their situation was reversed. The proof was in his throbbing, bleeding leg. And if it was Rune, he told himself, she's a traitor to the Republic. Whoever she was, the Moth had been in his grasp tonight. It was as close as he'd ever come. If he and Rune had been courting longer, he'd probably be able to tell if that slight frame pressed against him in the darkness belonged to her. He'd know how Rune felt beneath him, and would have been able to compare it to the girl he'd pinned down tonight. But as close as he'd come to Rune Winters, it wasn't nearly close enough to know the difference. Gideon's shoulder hurt from throwing himself at the door. He had just lifted his good leg to kick it down when Lila said, "It won't work." She motioned to something out of the window. Striding over, Gideon glanced through the pane. A blood-red moth fluttered below the hanging lantern outside, its delicate wings thin as residue. Like a fingerprint he could almost see through. "It's a spell." Gideon sighed. It would likely be hours before it faded and the door unlocked. He turned to Lila. Did you get a look at her? Lila shook her head. She kept her face covered and moved too quickly. We should have brought the hounds with us, and the Taskers. Gideon had intentionally left the Tasker brothers behind after they'd defied his orders and abused the last witch. Clearly that had been a mistake. 2 more soldiers would have made the difference, not to mention the witch-hunting hounds. If Gideon were being honest, he hadn't brought the hounds because the thought of sticking them on Rune made his stomach turn. He'd remembered her trembling beneath his touch in her bedroom, shivering in nothing but her underwear as he took her measurements. Gideon had gone soft on a murderous witch, or at the very least, a witch sympathizer. Fool. He'd let her dupe him into thinking she was an innocent girl, someone vulnerable and in need of protection. He admitted none of this to Lila, who was smashing the rest of the broken pane out of the window frame with the butt of her pistol. This is what we know, he said, giving up on the enchanted door, which wouldn't open until the signature faded. The Crimson Moth showed up at that wrong location tonight. A location I gave only to one person, Rune Winters. Even if she isn't the moth, she's obviously in league with her. It was enough to arrest her. If it was Rune, she'll know you set a trap for her, said Lila, using the scarlet sleeve of her coat to clear glass shards out of the pane. She'll know we're coming for her. I'd be on the first ship off the island if I were her. It was a desperate move, and though it was undoubtedly what any criminal should do if they wanted to escape him, the Crimson Moth didn't strike Gideon as someone who made desperate moves. There's a masked ball at the Creeds tonight, Rune had told him that morning. You could meet me there. When the window was free of glass, Lila pulled herself through and out the other side. We should ride for the docks. I have a better idea. Gideon winced as he limped to the window, trying not to put weight on his wounded leg. You head back to headquarters, assemble a hunting party, then go to the docks and make sure no ship leaves port tonight. From outside, Lila frowned at him. The lantern hanging above her head illuminated her face. You're not coming? I'm going to your parents' ball. Lila frowned harder. Rune invited me, he explained. If she wasn't here tonight and the moth is someone else, Rune won't yet know this was a trap. She'll be at Oakhaven Park. Grabbing hold of a windowsill, he glanced out at the moth still fluttering over the door. And if she's there? Lila asked, stepping away from the window. Gideon pulled himself through with a grimace. I'll arrest her for treason. 25. Rune. The grounds of Oakhaven Park backed onto a forest that spanned hundreds of acres. The home itself was modest compared to Wintersea House and had belonged to Seraphine Oaks before the Queen sent her into exile. Once a close friend of the Rosebloods, Seraphine fell out of favor with the previous queen, the mother of Elowyn, Annalise, and Cressida. Nan never spoke of it because it distressed her, but some believed that Seraphine's power surpassed the royal families. So out of fear or jealousy, or both, the Witch Queen banished her. Oakhaven Park sat empty until the Revolution, when the good commander gave it to his wife, Octavia Creed, as a spoil of war. Some couples keep separate bedrooms, Alex joked. Others keep separate estates. Though the wind had turned her clothes from sopping wet to damp, Rune still shivered as she rode Lady as far as she dared into the woods surrounding the property. Octavia kept her patrol, Rune knew, and she had no desire to run into it. Once she was inside the forest, shrouded by jack pines and balsam firs, her icy, trembling fingers unbuckled the saddlebag concealing her evening outfit. Rune was happy to strip the damp clothes off her body. Standing naked in the breeze but for the sheathed knife strapped to her thigh, she tightly braided her wind-dried hair into an effortless style she'd watched Nan employ whenever they were running late to some function. It was still a little damp, but not obviously wet. Next, she inspected the gash from Lila's shot, which was still bleeding. Rune had been lucky. If Lila's shot had been an inch closer, she'd have a bullet in her arm that would require digging out. This was a flesh wound, bloody but not deep. She withdrew one of the cotton strips she kept in Lady's saddlebag for emergencies, bound it around the wound, and tucked the ends underneath. Thankful she'd had the foresight to bring gloves, Rune pulled them on, concealing the bandage, and donned her dress and shoes. Last, she put on her mask for the evening, a white fox face with pointed ears. Fully dressed, Rune opened one more saddlebag and pulled out 4 sheets of tracing paper and a fountain pen. After folding the sheets and rolling them tightly around the pen, she tucked them down the front of her bodice. Taking her whistle out for the 3rd time tonight, she blew 2 long notes into the thin metal cylinder, telling Lady to go straight home. The moment the horse trotted away, Rune followed the footpath through the trees, allowing the house lights in the distance to guide her. Normally it would be exactly Rune's style to arrive fashionably late, waltzing in through the front doors and announcing herself to everyone. Tonight, though, she didn't want people to notice her delayed arrival. She wanted people to think she'd been there the whole time. Drawing nearer to the house, Rune contemplated going in through the kitchens, pretending to have gotten lost, but that would only make the servants talk. As she drew nearer still, she eyed the windows. They were close enough to the ground for her to open and climb through without soiling her dress. She decided on the ladder when voices nearby caught her attention. All that's left to do is sell Thornwood Hall. Alex? Rune was so relieved by the sound of his familiar timbre, she almost missed the words he'd spoken. Sell Thornwood Hall? She tucked her questions away for later. Adjusting her mask, she donned a more tedious costume, one that was second nature by now, the guise of a superficial girl who cared only for designer dresses, extravagant parties, and juicy gossip. Rune stepped out of the woods, heading toward the ring of young men circling a fire that blazed in an ornate iron fire pit. Despite their masked faces, her eyes found Alex in an instant. Through his iron mask, he gazed into the fire, as if pondering a problem that was plaguing him and searching for the answer in the flames. Unlike his brother, who was built like a soldier, Alex had a slender frame. As a devoted musician who spent his days practicing and composing, he often forgotten to eat. At her approach, Alex's attention snapped toward her. Rune? Seeing him was like a drowning woman sighting a buoy. She wanted to throw herself in his direction, loop her arms around his neck, and hold on for dear life. She did none of these things. The darkness sure turns you about. Still shivering, she stepped towards the delicious warmth of the fire. I came outside for some air, and the next thing I knew, I was lost in that jungle. She motioned to the woods behind her. The gentleman wearing a wolf mask said, I didn't realize you were here, Rune. The voice belonged to Noah Creed. Did you just arrive? Before she could spin the story that she'd prepared, Alex unbuttoned his coat and dropped it over her shoulders. Your teeth are chattering. Let's go inside before you freeze. The warmth of his body was still in the fabric, and Rune soaked it up. Wanting to thaw herself out further and give Noah an answer, she put her hands to the fire. Oh, but... I insist. Alex pressed his palm to the small of her back, turning her away from the heat. The tone of his words, which sounded friendly, had a sharpness beneath for Rune alone. She glanced up to find his golden brown eyes sapped of warmth. From the way his lips thinned, he wasn't only worried, but angry too. Angry at me? Too tired to resist, she let him lead her toward the house. Glancing over her shoulder, she waved goodbye to Noah and the boy in the frog mask, Bart Wentholt, she guessed, from the red hair. She implemented the first part of her plan to be seen at this party. All she needed now was Alex and Verity's cooperation to make it seem like she'd been there the whole time. In the fire's absence, she pulled Alex's wool coat firmly around herself. He silently led her out of the garden, past the cherubic statues, and up the stone steps into the house. Servants bustled past them, some carrying empty trays from the ballroom, bursting with music and chatter, while others rushed toward it with trays full of drinks and desserts. Rune had turned to follow them when Alex grabbed her hand. Sliding his fingers through hers, he pulled her in the opposite direction. "There's no need to manhandle me," she said, getting irritable. The less irritable half of herself was surprised at the fingers interlaced with hers. They'd never held hands before. Alex ignored her. "Where have you been?" he said, his jaw clenched as he tugged her down a long, empty corridor. The gold foil of patterned ferns glittered against the dark green wallpaper. "I've been thinking the worst." "There was no time to tell you." Rune glanced over her shoulder while keeping her voice down, "and it was too risky to send a telegram. Promise me something? If I start acting strange, scary strange, like saying or doing mean things for the pleasure of it, you must tell Verity, okay?" What Verity would do, Rune didn't know, but once a witch started corrupting herself with bad magic, she began to crave its power like a drug. After that first hit, it was difficult to resist coming back for more. Rune did not want to go down that path. "What are you talking about?" said Alex. She didn't feel any different, but maybe no one did. Maybe a witch had no idea what was happening to her until it was too late. Before the hall turned, Alex opened a door, his hand still gripping Rune's as he pulled her into the room. It smelled like books and burning wood inside. Bookshelves lined 3 of the 4 walls. Letting go of Alex's hand, Rune trod across the woven carpet, droned to the light of a crackling fire in the hearth, and past a massive oak desk. "I've been here before." Her gaze shot to the wall over the fireplace, and there it was, the map of the palace prison. A map she needed if she had any hope of saving Seraphine. Alex had remembered and brought her straight to it. The realization warmed her more deeply than the fire. "Alex, you still haven't told me where you were tonight." Alex stood behind her, the friendliness stripped from his voice, leaving only sharpness as he removed the coat from her shoulders. Still shivering and not ready to part with its warmth, Rune almost seized it, then realized he was peeling it away to look at her arm. Her silk glove had blood seeping through it. Oh no. Was that the reason he draped the coat over her? Did Noah and Bart notice? More gentle than his tone, Alex turned her toward him and started tugging the glove off her fingers one by one. The thin silver ring on his smallest finger glinted in the fire. "How did this happen?" "Lila shot me," she said, watching the silk slide down her arm to reveal the makeshift bandage, which was good and soiled. "Or shot at me. I was lucky. She almost missed." Alex went quiet. It was so rare for him to get angry, but she could feel the anger in him now, coiled tight like a spring. "And why was Lila shooting at you?" "I was at the old Seldom Harbor looking for Seraphine. Your brother set me up." Alex's gaze narrowed behind his lined mask. "What do you mean he set you up?" Taking the ruined glove, Rune threw it onto the fire, destroying the evidence. She slid off the second one and burned it too. Hopefully Verity had worn gloves tonight that she could borrow. Otherwise, she would need Alex to escort her home with his coat over her shoulders, and that would certainly make people talk. Boys who let girls wear their coats home were making their intentions known. But if they're busy talking about Alex and me, thought Rune, they won't be wondering about when I arrived. Rune told him everything that happened in the mine, leaving out the part beforehand where she went alone to Gideon's tenement building, stripped down to her underwear, and let him take her measurements. That was irrelevant information, she decided. As she filled him in, Alex crouched down and lifted the hem of her dress, reaching for the knife he knew she kept strapped to her thigh. They'd been in this situation so many times, working like cogs in a clock that had run smoothly for years, that Alex knew exactly where the knife was sheathed. Gideon intentionally misled me, she said as Alex drew the knife from under her dress and used its sharp edge to cut a long strip off her cotton shift. If he didn't suspect me before, he does now. If he noticed blood on the blade, he didn't remark on it. When he rose to face her, Alex handed her the makeshift bandage to hold while he untied the bloody one from around her arm. While he focused on this task, Rune studied him. Alex's golden mask ended at the tip of his nose, cutting across his cheeks and revealing lips that were pressed tight at the site of the gash in Rune's pale skin. The wound wasn't deep, but it was still bleeding freely. I asked you to end this thing with Gideon, he said, throwing the soiled bandage into the flames, then wrapping the fresh cotton strip around the wound. He contacted me, she said, defensive. He wanted to meet. Alex's elegant fingers secured the bandage and tucked the ends underneath. And you had no choice but to obey? He's my best chance of finding Seraphine. Alex breathed in deep, as if Rune were a child testing his patience. I need an alibi, she said, changing the subject. Can we say I came to this party with you tonight? Her wound freshly bandaged, she turned her focus to the map over the mantel. From here, it looked like a series of circles within circles. Before Alex could answer her, she moved to Octavia Creed's massive desk in the center of the room, piled high with records. Grabbing the heavy desk chair, Rune dragged it back to the fireplace, climbed onto it, and pulled out the tracing paper and pen from inside her bodice. She set both down on the mantel. We could say you came with me tonight, said Alex, watching her, if you agreed to my offer. What offer? She said, glancing over her shoulder. Her fox mask obscured her view of him. She would have pushed it back off her face, except both hands were occupied. My offer to help you rescue Seraphine, he said from where he leaned against the prison warden's desk, looking at her. I said I would help if you agreed to come with me to Kalis for a month. Rune bristled, gripping the fountain pen hard in her hand. 2 weeks, we said. It will take us 3 days to sail there, and 3 days to sail back. So no, you'll have to come for the full month. Why is he so adamant about this? It wasn't like him. Rune returned to the map, pressing a little too hard on the tracing paper as she followed the lines showing through from behind. You know I can't leave. I have... What happens when you succeed, Rune? What do you mean? She said, still tracing. There were 7 concentric circles, each depicting a section of the prison. She was on the 2nd section. What happens after you rescue every last witch from the purge? If Rune were honest with herself, deep down, she didn't believe she could save them all. She hoped to save Seraphine and more witches after that. But eventually, Rune expected to be caught. She was only one girl, and there were hundreds of witch hunters. I can't rescue them all, she admitted. staring at the untraced lines showing faintly through the translucent paper. For this exercise, let's say you can. When it's over, will you still hide yourself in plain sight, pretending to be what you despise, resenting everyone around you? They will never change their minds about you, Rune. Don't you want to be free of them? Of all of it? Rune lowered her pen. She didn't want to think about this, because Alex was right. Once, this island had been her home. It had been exactly where she belonged. But unless witches somehow seized power, it would never be that way again. And if a new reign of witches were possible, there was no going back to her old life with Nan. That life ceased to exist the day they dragged her away to be purged. Rune lifted her pen to the paper and kept tracing. She had 3 prison sections left to copy. I'll never succeed. Not completely. Witches would always be in danger in the New Republic, so this little game of what if was a waste of time. When her tracing was complete, Rune lowered the last piece of paper. It was then that she remembered what Alex had said around the bonfire outside. All that's left to do is sell Thornwood Hall. You're leaving for good, she realized aloud, turning to face him. Not for a month, and not just to study. You're going away forever. It felt like someone had pulled the chair out from under her. She struggled to find words. Does Gideon know? I haven't told him. Alex glanced away. I doubt he'll care. In fact, I'm sure he'll be relieved. Rune frowned. That made no sense. Alex pushed away from the desk, walking toward her. He stopped in front of the chair she stood on, his masked face tilted to hers. I want you to come with me. For a month, yes, you said that. Not for a month. I want you to leave with me and never come back. I want you to be free of this, Rune. You shouldn't have to live in constant fear for your life. He reached for her fingers again, sliding them gently through his. But I'll settle for a month for now. For now, if I must. For now. As if he were being patient with her. As if he would wait for as long as it took Rune to come to her senses. In Kalis, we'll go to the opera house every day of the week, where they show real operas, not that propaganda you despise. She looked away from him, afraid he would see how much she wanted that, to watch a real opera again, to talk about the intricacies of characters and themes on their carriage ride home. It would never be Nan sitting next to her, but that would be okay if Alex was beside her instead. We'll go to the ballet and the symphony. We'll spend weekends on the Umbrian mountains. His words tempted her. Kalis, where people didn't care if you were a witch and certainly didn't report you to the police. And Alex, the boy she trusted most in the world. She closed her eyes. This fragile feeling in her chest felt like hope. No. She shut the feeling down. She pulled her hand free. What you're describing is a happy ending. A fantasy. She used his shoulders to steady herself as she hopped down from the chair. And that's great. For you. Not everyone gets to have that. Countless witches had their happy endings stolen from them. Witches like Nan, and Verity's sisters. Seraphine would be stolen too if Rune couldn't save her in time. Tucking the traces under her arm and the fountain pen between her teeth, she dragged the chair back to the desk. You're right. Some people are determined to live out their own personal tragedies. She stopped, her hands still gripping the back of that chair, her whole body prickled with anger. What's that supposed to mean? How many of the witches you saved turn around and try to save you, Rune? I've told you before, I don't need saving. And you'll be telling me that the day they string you up to die while the city cheers. You'll be saying it while they cut your throat and bleed you dry. Why was he doing this? Alex was the one steady rock in her life, always there to lean on. They didn't fight. Not ever. Maybe that's what I deserve, she said, setting the small stack of tracing paper on the desk, each piece containing 1/4 of the prison's map. What? The word tore out of Alex like thunder from the sky. Putting the pen down, Rune rolled the pieces tightly around it and slid them back down her bodice. Look at me, Rune. He stood behind her now, but instead of turning, she stared down at a dark knot in the desk's wood. I betrayed my grandmother. I led the blood guard straight to our house. She fisted her hands as a wave of self-loathing crashed over her. The day they killed her, I stood there and watched it happen. I let them all believe I hated her. She was glad for the mask over her upper part of her face, which would help hide the tears forming in her eyes as she turned around to face him. Innocent people don't do things like that. She should have stormed that platform and denounced them all. She should have yelled the truth to the sky, that she loved Kestrel Winters and they were demons for wanting her dead. You did what you had to do to survive. He pushed back his mask. Kestrel wanted you to live, Rune. Don't throw away the gift she gave you. She glanced sharply away from him. You're wrong. It was no gift being allowed to live while the one you loved most was dead, because of you. Rune remembered the day they killed her. Kestrel Winters didn't cower and beg like a criminal. She stood before her killers with the dignity and poise of a queen. When Rune went to the purge, she wanted to go exactly like that, knowing she'd done everything she could to deliver other witches from Nan's fate. Sometimes it feels like you're afraid to look at me, said Alex. Placing his warm hands on her cheeks below her mask, he tilted her face back to his. Is it because I don't want to hurt you, or hunt you, or watch you die? His grip was firm, resolved. Do you believe you deserve those things, Rune? Looking at him was like watching an opera she didn't like. One of those ridiculous comedies where the character gets everything she ever dreamed of and lives happily ever after. Those operas were so unrealistic. They always made Rune want to cry, or stand up and leave. Sometimes she got the same feeling looking at Alex. He gently let go of her face and pushed back her mask, as if he wanted her to look at him. Rune. A sudden rattling at the door made him step sharply away from her. Alex grabbed his jacket to drop over Rune's shoulders to hide her bandaged arm, but it was too late. Verity burst in. Here you are! Their friend's brown curls were loose around her shoulders, and the scarlet dress she wore made her white skin paler than usual. If I have to listen to Bart Wentholt wax poetic about his shoe collection again, I'm going to scream. Does it never occur to him that nobody cares? She halted, glancing from Alex to Rune. What happened to your arm?